Hello, Brad. Welcome back to the Wax Museum.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Are things pretty normal there in Winnipeg?
Yeah, it's kind of normal. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, school's back in, so it's like another level of stress and there's more, parents talking and,
Mm,
there's cases in schools now and it's like, well, I
yeah.
guess that was gonna happen. It's
Yeah.
hard to kind of, make sense of what I mean. People always like, oh, like why can't the government do more? It's like, well, it is a virus. It's difficult to, actually do something. But yeah,
Why
no, it's
can't the
good. I
government?
think it's
Yeah.
good. There's a little bit of an uptick in cases, I think, but
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what to make of the whole situation.
I know. And you know what's funny? What's really funny is that you and I, this is part of our job,
Yeah, a
is
little bit.
protecting people from disease. And so, like, we're saying, we kind of sit and we're like, I'm not 100% sure what to make of it. And yet, I've got friends on Facebook that are 100% sure what to make of it. So there you
Yeah,
go.
there's a lot of people that are 100% sure of a lot of things.
It's bizarre. Well, I'm going to say, like, what we're talking about today, we're probably not 100% sure about either. Um, so I did a couple episodes on socialism, and it was kind of fun to delve into that and kind of understand a little more perspective on it, because I think in the end we're not talking about 100% socialism. I don't think we're talking about 100% capitalism. In the end, we end up with a mixed economy.
Right.
But I think it's good to kind of delve into the benefits of capitalism.
Right.
And one of the things I really liked from Yuval Noel Harari's book Homo Deus, which I've been saying wrong all this time apparently. Um, I mean, Homo Deus is a lot funnier, but um, there's like this portion toward the end of the book where he talks about like this Russian guy who goes to London, and he's talking to someone and he's like, "Hey, so I noticed you guys got like these grocery stores and you got these like bakeries," and he's like, "But the crazy thing is you don't have any bread lines. Like, who disperses your bread?" And of course the answer is not that there's some central guy that
Yeah.
disperses bread. It is supply and demand. And this is probably one of the most positive ways of looking at capitalism, is that there aren't shortages because supply and demand works.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is certainly, a lot of the arguments, capitalism versus socialism, they kind of focus on kind of a pragmatic view, like, under which system are people, better off and that sort of thing. And people make all kinds of economic arguments. But capitalism is really founded on individual rights. If
Mm.
you want individual rights, then you want capitalism. That's just kind of how that works. Um, Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, once you give somebody the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, property rights fall. Like you have property, you expect the government to step in. And if someone steals something from you, you'd say, hey, that person stole from me. And the government will charge that person with stealing and make things kind of right. Under socialism, you don't have property and you don't get to own things. Property is owned by the state. And you're not an individual under a socialist regime. You are just a member of a group. And so the government decides what group is taken from and which group is given to, and you really have no say. It's not up to individual rights. You're basically left to the mercy of government, a bureaucracy somewhere to decide what is the common good.
But that's more so like what's happened in Russia, what's happened in China, and it's more like state-owned capitalism, where it's basically the state owns
No, it's
everything.
state owned. It's the opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is individuals have property rights. Individuals have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And from that is property rights. If you want to be able to own a house, build a business, develop something with like-minded people, you can only do that with capitalism. What we have isn't either really capitalism or socialism. It is a mixed economy.
Yeah.
Even when
Yep.
people talk about like, they're like, oh, give me some good examples of socialism. Like, well, you know, like Scandinavian countries, they're doing it pretty good. Like they're not, like Denmark has clearly stated unequivocally, we are not a socialist country.
No.
They're not collectivized. That's socialism. Socialism is an abdication of individual rights in favor of group rights.
See, the way it was explained to me is that it's more so about the workers owning the means of production, not the government owning.
But who are the workers? The workers are the government. It's the state. Socialist, part of the trick is it's always like, oh, it's the community. Oh, it's the workers. Oh, it's the people. No, it's the state. It always devolves into groups and bureaucracies and groups fighting over control of those bureaucracies because that's where all the power is. If you get rid of that, everybody has individual rights and there's no need to control or decide which groups because everything is just distributed according to merit, according to the free market.
Right. Okay. So, so basically, yeah, that was my understanding anyways, from the 2 episodes I did, was like talking about the workers owning the means, and a great example was like a worker cooperative. So instead of having that hierarchical structure, and I've thought about this, I'm like, if I was to start my own business, I think it'd be cool to, you know, start out with me and a couple of partners and we divide everything evenly. And like our incentive, now this is still working within a capitalistic society.
Correct. That's an important
and it's like whatever profits we make, we would share. And so the incentive for the 3 of us is that like, well, we want the profits to be good so that the 3 of us can benefit. But there's no like kind of like, I want to lower the wages of Brad and so that I get more money, right?
Is.
Like, what was
that's completely what business is, right? If you have under a capitalist economy, if you want to participate in a worker co-op, you're free to do so.
Exactly.
If you want to have a Hutterite colony, you're free to do so. Like Hutterite colonies are not really capitalist or socialist, right? They're basically a socialist little dot in a capitalist system.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
They share amongst themselves, but they're still participating in economy. They're still buying and selling goods on a free market, including labor.
So when we're talking about like how things are directed, right? Like, whereas, you know, in a more kind of socialist, if we were going to talk about a socialist kind of subdivision of capitalism, like a Hutterite colony, we're trying to give everybody kind of equal power on the means of production.
But
whereas
it's voluntary.
Capitalism, yeah, it's voluntary, but where capitalism is more so about, isn't it supposed to be the consumer that is directing the ends of production?
There is kind of a criticism that socialists make towards capitalism. They say basically that capitalism is really good for giving people what they want, but not for telling people what they should want, right? Which is kind of, it's paternalistic. It's saying that, I mean, like we wouldn't have iPhones without capitalism. No government, bureaucracy anywhere in the world would have said, you know what, we're going to do this.
Oh, totally.
It just doesn't exist.
I don't know how that's a critique. Like that seems to be the good thing about capitalism, is that people are actually
people that
deciding.
Want to control society. For people who actually who don't trust people, they're actually against individual rights. There are some people that go like, you know, individual rights for me, I'm smart, I can behave responsibly, but I don't trust, you know, humans. Humans need to be told what to do and where to live and who to have sex with and all of these things. Like the idea is not even so much like communism or who owns, it's just about individual rights. And I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means that you're free to do anything that you choose, so long as it doesn't interfere with the rights of somebody else, right? So you can own something and it's yours. In a capitalist system, you can actually own something, and if I steal from you, then it's considered stealing because you have property rights, and there's recourse under the law. Under a socialist system, the government, like, you don't have property. There is no property. The government gives you a house to live in. They give you the food to eat. They tell you what to do. And I mean, yeah, this is like China and Russia and all of that. But it's also in Africa. It's also in Cuba. It's also in Venezuela. One of the first things that socialists, or when people kind of collectivize, you need to kind of put in these kind of really kind of like dictator or authoritarian type rules, like you can't leave. I mean, if you want to compare capitalism, socialism, it's really easy because the world gives us essentially like matched pair studies where you can actually directly see the difference that happens to people, to society under capitalism versus socialism. So East Germany versus West Germany is an example. There was a wall to keep people trapped in the socialist system, people trying to escape from socialism into capitalism, literally. Another example is North Korea and South Korea. After the Korean War, South Korea adopted more capitalist approaches and North Korea went the other way. And the standard of living in comparing North Korea to South Korea, I mean, I don't know, like if somebody suggests that socialism good after making those comparisons, I mean, I have others as well. And that's what happens when you don't give individuals freedoms. I mean, innovation stops. Even in Marxist theory, that's the idea, right? Marx uses capitalism to innovate and to build up all of the things that the world and society needs to live, to build up capital, to build up wealth. And then at some point, you just kind of stop and you switch to communism, where now everybody just shares everything and lives happily ever after. But it doesn't work. It's never worked in any example anywhere.
But we're
Really.
talking about like, and I don't think like what we were discussing as far as like democratic socialism was not like all about the state owning everything and taking away everybody's freedoms, right?
Right.
I think it was more from that standpoint of like a worker co-op. So so basically, like I think that's my understanding anyways, is that like the theory is that if we allow the people to direct the ends of production by they consume what should be, you know, what should be consumed, and then what should be produced will be produced. And is that basically the theory behind capitalism? Is you give everybody individual rights, and there's kind of this cycle that happens, is that people will produce what needs to be produced and people will consume what needs to be consumed.
I guess it's a little bit tricky. Like capitalism, you got to kind of separate capitalism from free markets, right? So capitalism is, okay, it's a socio-political system. It's a political economic system. It is just what comes out of having individual rights. That's it. If you give somebody like the US, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, property rights are derived from that. You can't give somebody the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and not give them the right to own property and to own land. Right. And to build something, right? I mean, you build a business, you build a reputation, you build your experience, you work, you develop. That's what it's possible under capitalism. Under socialist ideals, and it's socialism is sneaky. Some people kind of go through like a radical revolution, like China and Russia, but some people it's more kind of like incremental. And examples like in Scandinavian countries where there's an income tax rate more than 50%, it's like, how is that not fascist? It's fascism because you're taking more from the business than the business takes, right? Like once you go over a threshold, you're just stealing, you're taking from people. And when it's for something that, they don't want or need or participate in, then it's unfair. So, really, like I still believe in like a progressive tax system, right? Where the more you make, the more you pay. But it shouldn't be punitive. And right now there's a lot of rhetoric that isn't, it's not caring for the poor, it's hating the rich. When you hear
like
people talk about Jeff
exist.
Bezos and all of this and how much money they've made and they only give this much to charities, and it's like the amount that Jeff Bezos gives to charity pales in comparison to the good that he's created from Amazon. I mean, he got rich because almost everybody in the world voluntarily agreed to give him money. So why is that evil, right? Why should that be attacked? You're attacking success for success. Because he's successful, you're attacking him.
And you'd rather promote success,
Yeah. He's
right? It's
benefited
like, let's
everyone.
reward people for their success.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, this is the invisible hand, right? Is like, it's really, it's kind of magic when you think about it, because it's like, well, I want this, I buy it, I give money to this person. If what they do is good, people will buy it. And the invisible hand basically says that progress will happen just simply by people doing what works in their self-interest. Do you think this invisible hand can be trusted? Or do you think that there are times when the invisible hand cannot be trusted?
Um, I mean, the invisible hand, it's kind of like it's kind of tapping into like a weird kind of paranoid socialist fear that, you know, people are just going to run and do stuff, and like big business is all bad and people are out to like make a quick buck.
No, I'm
Uh,
talking about
yeah,
purely from the theory of, what is it called? The wealth of nations. You know, it said there's an invisible hand, right? So I'm like,
yeah.
okay, there's an invisible hand, but can it be trusted? Without even talking about, you know, any paranoia someone may have, like realistically, from your point of view, can it be trusted, or do you think there are times where it can't be?
Um, so yeah, like capitalism, I mean, there's kind of people that go to mixed economies, and that's the people that would say, you know, we can't trust the system to just kind of run.
Yeah,
And then let's say
yeah.
Fed capitalism, which is, you know, just let's say Fed, it's leave alone. It's kind of from the French Revolution. The government was asking, like,
And
you know,
laissez-faire.
what can we do to make your lives better and easier and to help you succeed? And the answer was, leave us alone, like do
Mm-hmm.
nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, the government doing nothing is the best for everybody involved. And this goes from like antitrust to copyrights and patents and regulating the airwaves and all of these rules and regulations, building codes. There's just so much kind of in the system that makes it really hard to do business. Where you have businesses, you know, and now it's the diversity. Like you have businesses concerned about what proportion color their employees are, or how many gay people, or how many,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Europeans, or how many descendants, or all these like.
Affirmative action. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it's not enough. That's not the issue, but the issue is that there's so much for business to deal with, and it's kind of not
Cumbersome.
fair to try
Mm-hmm.
and like, I mean, you have people that are driving the economy, they're employing like 80%, 90% of the people in small business, right? And then you're making it so hard to employ these people, and you're putting in so many like extra taxes and fees and red tape. And what happens is it's kind of the dishonest businesses that can succeed when there's a lot of government intervention, because they're working to, you know, fulfill a government mandate or to get funding or to fulfill this, and they're not really just focusing on customers and good service and lowering costs and doing what is good for business, right?
They're looking for loopholes. And
Yeah,
I think, you know, this is something too that, you know, my understanding is like Elon Musk is a guy that like basically everything he sets up, he uses government funding to set it up. And it's like,
yeah,
it's crazy because it's like this guy's making a killing, but he's still getting government funding. I think, you know, it's the same thing too with arenas, like sports arenas. They basically wait for like a a municipal election, and then they'll like basically blackmail them, like say,
yeah.
hey, listen, you guys have got to build, you know, fund this arena. And I'm like, how much money do these dudes have? Like, why do they have to use tax money to build an arena, right?
Yeah, that's an example, like that's kind of anti-capitalist. A capitalist would say, if you want to build an arena, if you think you can make money doing so, then do so. Like you're free to
Yeah,
do
get
that.
some
Buy the land,
investors and
build
build
it,
it. You're going to
and
make
make it.
money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an example too where all of the problems that come out of that, there's a lot of like, oh, we can't do this, or now we can't build this arena. Like they put in like they kind of make it so that you don't have to compete. So they're like, okay, well, we'll fund this arena, but then there's a law saying that you can't build any arenas anywhere in the city for the next 10 years.
Mm.
right? So they put in all the, and you have to have this included, and you can't do this, and you have to have this included, and it has to have, this section, and this much has to be devoted to this.
Is
And,
that what happens when the government funds it? Then they
yeah,
can dictate all these things and
because they're
make
not giving the money for free, right? They're like,
no,
here's some money, but before we give it to you, that
always.
kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's cronyism, right? There's a problem that people are like,
Yeah.
oh, capitalism, and people call and they say like, oh, this is an example of capitalism and it's bad. It's like, that's not capitalism at all.
Arenas are
It's
not an
cronyism,
example
it's
of capitalism.
corruption, it's
Yeah.
there's public-private partnerships. What it ends up being is publicly subsidized, privately profitable, and that happens just so much. It actually happens in the U.S. prison system, a later topic perhaps.
I think, yeah, yeah. Um, and I think, I think a lot about when the salary cap system started coming into the NHL. And I felt like that was at some level kind of like a socialism idea where I was just
Well,
kind of like, you know what? Like, if your team can't make money, it should just not exist. Like, why are we lowering the bar for everyone? I mean, I'm okay with it now, but at first I didn't like the idea because I was just like, this is dumb. Like, you're artificially forcing teams to reduce their talent.
well, and I mean, the NHL itself is an entity, so this isn't the state, right? So this
No,
isn't,
no, no, no.
so yeah,
But
like, and they really do want, they want like parity. That was their goal, right? They
yeah,
actually did want to
yeah,
take the top teams down and make the lower teams better, because
yeah,
parity was viewed as more entertaining. So,
yeah.
and it's actually kind of parallels, because that's what social justice people do now, right? What they want is equity. They want everyone to be the same and to have the same amount of stuff, not
Right.
just equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. And that's
Ooh,
really what
Jordan
you're doing,
Peterson
right?
right there.
You're like, oh, if you're too high up, we'll just take this and give it to this person, and then everybody has, equity. And that's, nobody wins, right? Because if you try to devise a system where it's givers and takers and groups fighting with each other, then the people who win are the most corrupt, the most evil, the biggest liars, right? The people that are willing to do unethical things, because that's who's going to get to be in charge of, making the decisions as to who gets money taken from and who gets money given to. Who gets to have a job and who doesn't get to have a job, what kind of people do this work and what kind of people, like, it just goes, and it's kind of like an avalanche towards really oppressive government. Our
It's
government is
interesting.
growing, the US government is growing. Like,
Yeah.
you asked the question about what's better, big business or big government?
Yes.
Yeah, you can't have one without the other. There's no such thing as big business without big business, or without big government, without government intervention. So a good example, and this goes to capitalism versus socialism and that kind of a thing, is I guess the late 19th century in the US, building railroads, trying to build railroads out to the West, kind of the new frontier. People weren't building railroads out to California because they didn't really think it was economically viable, right? They weren't sure. Like, there's other forms of transportation. We don't know if rail is going to be needed, all those types of things. But the government wanted to, advance the discovery of the frontier and making new claims. And so they encouraged the railroads to build, and they gave them all kinds of, like, no competition, you can do
Right.
this, all kinds of funding and grants and all of this. And there were other railroads that were built, completely private, no government intervention, no government funding. And those were the successful railroads. Those were the railroads that ran on time, people didn't complain about. And a lot of the protests and farmers, and like, they could increase their prices because there was no competition, right? Because the government got involved and said, okay, well, we want you to build these rail lines. We know it's expensive, so we're going to give you, like, exclusive area. Nobody else can build any railroads in this area. And then you'll have the railroads lobbying the government to say, like, well, don't let the steamboats in there, and don't let these guys in there. Don't let this industry advance because we want to, maintain this. And, you got us to do it. We didn't want to do it. And that's the kind of system. And that's actually
So the government
where
made it
big
bigger.
business, the term big business, actually started with those railroads and those problems. That kind of coined that term.
Hmm. That's interesting. Well, you think about it too. Like, Air Canada, at least for a long time, was owned by the government, wasn't it?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm
And I
not sure.
mean,
Petro-Canada was.
WestJet was privately built, and WestJet, like most Canadians, anyways, would say they like WestJet more than Air Canada.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it's also kind of, it's worker owned, isn't it? Like, that is more like they're shareholders, anyways. The
Yeah.
workers are shareholders in it.
Well, and like that's kind of the part of this, like when like these attacks on capitalism, like, oh, it's the owners and the shareholders, like buy the company then. Like you if you want to own the company that you work for, if it's publicly traded, you can own it, right? If you're complaining about Jeff Bezos making all so much money, buy some Amazon stock. Like it's just people, right? That's the problem. It's just people, it's business owners, and there's lots of different ways to run business. PCL is a construction company in Winnipeg or Canada, and it's 100% employee owned.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of different ways to run a business, and
well, that's
you
it.
have
Within
a capitalist government, you're free to enter into any of those. But if your government actually crosses the line over and gets into socialism, then that's when you do actually have your rights being taken away, and you can't make those choices, and you're going to be forced into doing what the government allows you to do.
And I can see where overregulation becomes a problem. And so, like, when we talk about like minimum wage, would you say that like there should be no minimum wage?
That would be the standard, let's say, fair capitalist argument.
Would that be your argument, though, or would you just say some people would say that?
No, I would support that if it was, if it worked. I'm not very pro labor union, I guess. So what happens is minimum wages are essentially put in place kind of by skilled workers to push unskilled workers out of the job market. That's how it works. That's kind of how it started. If I'm a contractor and I want to get somebody to paint, do some general renovation work, and I have a tradesman certified by the government, licensed by the government, all of that. He's $20 an hour, but I can hire 3 guys at $15 an hour. Or at $5 an hour each. So I can pay these guys, 3 guys, for $15 an hour, and I can kind of get the same amount of work. But if you impose a minimum wage at, say, $15 an hour, then those 3 guys who are unskilled workers are out of a job, and I have to only hire 1 person at $15 or $20 an hour, and I can't hire as many people, and I can't innovate. It cuts into profits, right? But it's never a good thing when government intervenes in the economy and sets prices, right? I don't like supply management for dairy or those things. I mean, when governments try to set a price on oil or set a price on anything, it just kind of perverts the system of supply and demand, and businesses adapt to kind of a false system, and you end up with bad things happening. That's and even boom bust cycles like the crash in 1929, people like blame it on capitalism, but it's really the government interventions that kind of rigged the economy that created that. And it's governments going, oh, wait, no, we can fix it. We'll just do this. We'll just do this. We'll just do this. And then they're just all kind of like, oh, we shouldn't have done any of that. And it crashes. And then the recovery from the 29 crash actually took a lot longer because they were putting in more government controls to try and fix what had happened. Not really, I mean, it's an argument what caused, right? But in a sense, what they were intervening in the economy. They created a system, conditions where there was a bubble. The stock market crashed. And then they said they put in more controls on business and really delayed the recovery out of that recession because they were putting in more government interventions. Like they were band-aiding themselves, like they were putting layers and layers of regulation. And we got a lot of new regulations kind of in that time frame as well.
So do you think, okay, so if we go back to the $5 an hour each, are you thinking then that consumer products would be low enough within this society where you could pay someone $5 an hour, where that $5 an hour could be a living wage for that person?
Well, when you artificially increase wages,
Hmm.
you do drive up the cost of products,
Totally. Yeah.
right? I mean, when people talk about raising the minimum wage, the people who are most against raising the minimum wage are people making just above minimum wage. If you're making way
Yeah.
above minimum wage, it's almost like, I don't care, man. If they're making, if it's
If that's going to
$8 and
help
it's
people, that's
$15,
fine. Yeah. Yeah.
whatever, it doesn't matter, right? But if minimum wage is now like 8 and we're going to move it to 15, if you're making 12, you're against that.
Oh,
Because you
totally.
know that, like, right now your spending, your spending power is that of somebody who makes $4 more than minimum wage.
Totally.
When they
Yeah.
raise it, you'll have the spending power of somebody who now makes minimum wage.
100%. And that's like my buddy. I have a friend who's told me, he's like, I've worked for like 10 years at this position to get to $15 an hour. And now they're raising minimum wage to that. And it's like basically everything he's gained over however many years, right? I made up 10. I don't
Yeah.
know if it was 10. But like all this gain that he's made, it's gone in a flash. And so
But I
like
mean,
I understand there's definitely, if minimum wage does work, there's got to be a threshold at which it does work. And
right.
I think that 15 may be excessive.
Yeah, and the best level is really 0. So
Mm.
going back to my example of these 3 unskilled workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with no minimum wage, they have a job and they're gonna be in like the real economy, right? I'm a reputable business. I follow all the other labor laws. I do right things and report things to the government. I'm responsible. I don't make them, do unsafe work. They have the rights. They have the right to refuse unsafe work. They have the right to a lot of things that workers have the right to.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that because we're working with occupational settings.
Right.
But when you oppose that minimum wage and I fire those guys and I hire the one guy at $20 an hour, those guys are still going to be working, but they're going to be working in like the black economy where they don't have those protections, where they don't have the right to say, no, this is unsafe, where they don't get overtime and they don't get all of the things that come along with having what is called a legitimate job, because we've created a system where it's only legitimate if you can pay somebody $10 an hour or whatever it is. And so everybody who's working for less than that is working in the black economy. They're not reporting their taxes. They don't have like the workplace safety. Workplace safety officers aren't inspecting their workplaces because they're not official workplaces, because we've forced them out of the legitimate economy.
So you think like, so these companies that can't afford this $15 an hour as a business model, there's some of them anyways are going to end up going black market and just breaking all the rules just so they can get the work done?
No, the people, there is an economy that is like off the books.
Right.
And it's because I can't hire an employee and pay them $4 an hour.
Right.
So I don't, but those people, if they either starve to death or get government handouts, which is part of the whole kind of angle towards minimum wage, it's to make people more dependent on the government, to have more, it ends up being really fascist, right? Like, so socialism is the state owns the means of production, the state owns property. Capitalism or laissez-faire is it's just individuals own. Fascism is when the state doesn't own, but they control. So they say, okay, we're not going to own your business, but we're going to tell you what to do, how to make it, how much to make, where to sell, where you can sell, how you can sell, to whom you can sell under those conditions. So those types of controls on business, those are really more fascist than socialist. If you kind of want to start talking about isms.
Right. If we want to get into isms. No, and I mean like, okay, so basically, like, do you think that like there's anything preventing these companies then from trying to drive down the work wage as much as possible so they can maximize their profits Like, because that's
No,
the biggest argument is that like
no.
every
It's a flaw.
capital.
It's flawed logic. It's kind of like kind of bad Marxist theory, where it views the world as like oppressor and oppressed, and
Right.
there's only so much of a pie, and it's going to split. And if you want a bigger portion, it has to come out of my piece. That's how communists kind of sell their ideals.
Zero sum
But it's
game.
not true. It's a zero sum game, exactly.
And so you
In
see it
capitalism,
as
there is no
raise it.
oppressor oppressed. People
Uh-huh.
who talk about like employer employee as being
Mhm.
like bourgeoisie and proletariat, it's crap.
Hmm.
It's intellectual nonsense to suggest that. Under capitalism, you have free individuals interacting together, like in cooperative manner to mutual benefit.
Do you
So,
think then, like, what about slavery? Do you think that slavery was driven by government intervention, or was that just capitalism in its purest form?
well, it's not capitalism in its purest form at all, because capitalism gives everybody individual rights, right?
So you can't
So it's
make
the
humans a
opposite of
commodity
capitalism.
within capitalism, and that's where slavery didn't fit the capitalist model because it didn't give them their individual rights, and it
Right?
had
No,
turned them
it's
into a
that
commodity.
would just be an absolute slander on behalf of kind of collectivist people to make that kind of a thing. It's capitalism at its purest is it's slander.
Hmm.
Capitalism is based on individual rights and
And
individuals being able to own property.
when that property can't be people.
No, people are people.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
No, I
right. I mean,
feel you.
that's exactly what it is. Um, businesses, there were businesses, and their business was slavery, right?
Mhm.
And you could buy slave bonds. That was a thing from Homo from Sapiens that kind of blew my
Mhm.
mind. Is picturing middle class Dutch families in the 16th century, kind of saying, "Oh yeah, well the slave bonds are really doing well this year," and that kind of a thing. It's kind of really weird.
Yeah.
No, capitalism is not that. I mean, yeah, you could call like those companies, it is capitalism, but no, the foundation of capitalism, it would not be capitalism. Capitalism is individual rights. So
Okay, what about the treatment of animals then? Like when you talk about animals, like there's no incentive within a capitalistic society to treat animals well, is there?
how is it relevant?
Well, because
I
I'm
mean,
thinking
like
like you went
property, like
from.
if yeah, like I mean, yeah, like capitalism, we can own a dog. People breed dogs and they sell dogs, so that's capitalism. But I mean,
Well, I'm thinking of
the
other
defense
living
there is
things.
it's a
It's
free market.
obviously like you're saying you can't really just exploit people in capitalism because people have
Right.
individual rights, but animals don't have individual rights in capitalism, do they?
Right.
So
They
they
don't
can be a
have rights.
commodity and there's not really any kind of
Yeah.
like with if you bar any government regulation, there aren't really ethics when it comes to animals, is there?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a weird thing. If you want to say, like, if you're a dog breeder,
Hmm.
um, then you would have to compete with other dog breeders,
Right.
and there'd be a free market for price. So you're not gouging anybody, or
Hmm.
like there's no, you don't have, you wouldn't have like a monopoly. Like if the government said, John Howie poodle breeder is the only person you can buy a poodle from, that would be exploitive of people. But if you were a dog breeder, you would have to behave responsibly towards animals, um, insofar as like meeting your customers' expectations, right?
So this, I mean,
Um,
I guess what's interesting about this is like I feel like with this capitalism and consumer driven everything, it kind of makes the assumption that people on a whole are good or people on a whole are smart enough to make good consumer choices. And
well,
I'm
should
like,
they be given individual rights? Like, should people be given the right to live freely and choose their own path?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think though within reason, I guess this is my, and I mean, it's kind of like when we talk about COVID, where it's like, well, if we just don't tell people to wear masks and we just let them decide, let them do their own research, I'm like, I don't really trust most people's ability to do their own research. And
I don't
so like
trust anybody's ability to do research right now.
I do like, and I mean, I do like how, for the most part, the Canadian government, like, I know you could talk about the lockdowns and stuff like that, and I get that that was oppressive, but like when the government said, okay, here's our thing, is we think we're suggesting that you guys need to like keep, you know, at least 6 feet distance between people, and you know, like if you can't, we recommend you wear a mask. And there was no, for the most part, there was no like saying you have to wear a mask. And it was like municipal rules that started doing that, businesses that started doing that, right? But I'm like, I like that. That kind of makes sense. But if you like have government, I get, you know, like there's a point where it becomes oppressive and everything like that. But like, I think there's like some kind of a bit of a structure where you could say, well, this is the legitimate information that's coming out.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
know like it's hard because it's like, who do we trust?
well, and it's hard because um, this is like a violation of our rights.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, like freedom of association, freedom
Oh,
of mobility,
totally.
like all of these things are kind
Totally.
of like, meh. But it's when it is like, and there's a saying, right? Like never let a good crisis go to waste. And there
Yeah.
is a pattern where, I mean, after 9/11, you had just unprecedented new laws
Yeah.
and stripping people of liberties and freedoms. And, you know, there is a tendency for governments to kind of use crises to kind of wrest more power and also
Absolutely.
push through
Yeah.
other legislation. So it is kind of a bit scary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would not, I'm not, I wouldn't, I mean, in Winnipeg, there's a story like, this was earlier on, kids got tickets for like, they were skateboarding at like a skateboard park outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that just conjures up like Gestapo type stuff, right? Where,
Well, the outdoor stuff is something I really don't understand. I'm like, if you're outside, you're breathing fresh air. And I
yeah,
mean, like when people
sunlight.
talk about building up immunity and they're like, I can't wear a mask, it's going to wreck my immunity
Yeah,
system. You know, and it's like, I'm living too much of a sterile life. I'm like, I do not recommend you go into a crowded building and spend 8 hours a day without a mask and expose yourself to the virus because it's good for you. I'm like, if you want to go outside and
yeah,
roll around in the dirt to build
yeah,
up your immunity system,
yeah,
makes total sense.
yeah,
But don't like, and I was saying this to my daughter, I'm like, it doesn't make sense to me say, go inside to build up your immunity. Why don't you lock yourself in the bathroom after someone didn't flush the toilet and that'll build up your immunity? It's like, that
yeah.
doesn't make sense. That's not what our human bodies were designed for or evolved for, right? And I'm like, to me, it makes more sense to say, well, outside natural makes more sense, right? And so,
Yeah.
but I guess my problem is like the whole COVID thing and a lot of the debate I see on Facebook gives me less faith, gives me less faith in the general public to make good decisions.
Yeah, like,
And
but you know,
democracy,
we've had
though,
such a
is
long
based on
time
that too.
where you haven't had, you know, people haven't had to kind of make their own decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of have this question I ask people. It's like, you know, like when you go into into the supermarket, do you have a sense that, you know, someone in the government has evaluated all of these products and that all of these products are safe and that they don't contain hazardous ingredients? And most people kind of go like, well, yeah, like you wouldn't sell something that's unsafe because the government checks everything. It's like, no, it's completely unsafe. No one checks. No one knows what's in these products. All of the labeling laws, like you can say like proprietary. It's like, what is that? No one knows. It's anything they want to put in, right? Like,
I love the term
uh,
proprietary. Like when you're reviewing SDSs, right?
yeah,
And you see like it's like 65% proprietary. And I'm like, I
yeah.
want to start saying that. It's like, hey, John, what are you doing? Proprietary.
But there really are, like there's a system where, you know, there's chemicals that they used to list and then they
Mm-hmm.
showed up that they cause cancer and that they're
Mm-hmm.
kind of like banned. So they just include that in what they call fragrance at the end. Like they put in products that don't really mean anything, or you have like a CI 7469 or some kind of, and that's where they actually like put the ingredients that are banned. They just take them from the listed part and put them in the unlisted ingredients, and they just
So
repeat this, repeat.
so a lot of this is loopholes. Like you have government
Yeah,
regulation and then people find loopholes and they do maybe more sinister things than they would have done than what they would have done had there not been government regulation. Is that kind of your argument?
Well, like it's weird because there is a system kind of where um, when people went to go shop, people be like, oh, I have this product, I'm going to sell this product. And you'd be like, does it really work? Is it safe? Like you kind of think, you kind of do some research, maybe you check out what other people said about this product before you make the decision to buy it. Now you just go in and just buy it, right? You just like, it's going to be safe. It's on a shelf. Like everything on the shelf is safe.
So we have
Everything with any kind of drug is going to be safe. It's same thing with banks too, actually. Banks were independent, and if a bank failed, you lost your money, right? And that's actually one of the things that came out of 1929. There was a few banks that actually did fail in the crash. And so the government was like, oh, we never want banks to fail again. So we're going to make this big deposit insurance corporation. And now when people go to banks, they're like, I mean, do you think all the banks are the same in Canada? They are. They're all protected. It's not like if one bank fails, your cash deposits are insured by the government. So if Royal Bank fails, the taxpayers will pay your money. So the banks are like, wow, there's no reason we can't fail. Like and it just completely changes the business. It changes how they operate, and it changes how we interact with them. Like we don't question banks. We don't go like, is it really safe to put my money with you? Like how much, like what are your reserves? Like how do you operate? Like do you do all this weird, financial stuff?
Yeah.
Separate your banking branch from your, like you could ask these questions, but the government does it for us. And there's just a pattern of, it's like a paternalistic, right? And I think a lot of times there's this sense that people talk about, like people want a strong man. They want somebody to come along and tell them what they should be doing. So there really is an underlying kind of thread of like people actually do want the government to tell them what to do and how to do it and how to behave. But I don't think that anybody is going to be better off in that situation.
My thing though is what I find, and again, back to COVID, it's like people are like, you're a bunch of sheep for following, what Dr. Henshaw says.
But there's a grain of truth in that, because we've had decades of having the government take care of us and tell us what to do and tell us, what we should take and how to do this. And so there are some people that just are really doing that. They are sheeple, right? But I had a friend that somebody stopped in the street and yelled at her for walking because they weren't like 6 feet apart. It was like her and her daughter.
Yeah,
so come on, like we gotta start
that's
being
silly.
reasonable. But some people take that and they just go with it, right? Because people who like you're 100% certain. Like if you're 100% certain, well, I'm 100% certain you're wrong, right?
Yeah,
I can guarantee that.
Well, that's it. And so what I find is a lot of times people decide not to trust the government, so they go listen to the Rebel News, or they go to like this like YouTube channel, and they eat up every bit of this, like their own research, right? But their own research really is they're following a stream of people, like it's a new flock of sheep. And it's like, oh my gosh, like that doesn't fix it. It's like, if you want to be an independent thinker, you don't just go follow someone else. You got to pick and choose from different things. Like if you say, I don't trust the mainstream media, that doesn't mean that everything the mainstream media says is wrong, and then everybody who says the opposite of what they're saying is right. Like that's more foolish, because what happens with the mainstream media is like, I would say, and I'm going to say like at least more than 50% of what they're saying is actually legit. And so you've got to like be able to see what's legit in it, and then be able to question the things that are sketchy, right?
Yeah. Like I kind of like, all media is spin. And to add to what you're saying there, I think, so CNN in 3 hours of reporting, most of what they say is true, right? It's accurate, but news, like it's what they're not telling you. Like the fact that the stories that they're covering, the topics that they're covering, the way they're covering, it's all slanted in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And even if you were to watch it and you were really critical and you understood the opposing views and everything, they're still just telling you like the topics are chosen as well. So even that's already just even if you're completely unbiased, you still have spin because you've chosen those topics and not chosen others.
Totally. And I mean, I think, you know, like a wise person is able to say, okay, this is what CNN's spin is, and be aware of that. And then go like listen, you know, you watch Fox News and you see what their spin is, and then you read between the lines, you know, like, and that's, I mean, I use the example all the time about how, like, I think it was Rebel News or something like that reported that Trudeau groped a woman in 2003. And I was like, okay, Rebel News is reporting this. I don't know if this is true or not. And then CBC reported the same story. And I'm like, okay, this is true.
Yeah, I had that when
CBC has every incentive to not report this. And they
when
did.
Sophie Trudeau got, I just heard somebody was like, yeah, the prime minister's wife has it now. And I'm like, just like completely like, I just don't believe you, right? Like, but then I was like, oh, yep, CBC is saying, yeah, okay, it was real, but yeah, there you go. But
and I mean, it's like if CBC reports something good about Trudeau, I'm gonna fact check that with someone else, right? Because they have all the incentive in the world
CBC
to say good
is
things
pretty
about
not biased. I mean, individual people clearly have their opinions if you're on Twitter or something, but CBC will criticize government when it's appropriate to criticize, I find. But yeah, it's funny because I on the online the other day I saw videos of these protests and protesters with like weapons, like attacking police officers and all this. And I'm like, what is this? Where is this? I'm like, this is Breitbart. One, why is this in my Facebook feed? Two, why is nobody else showing this? Like, why is this the only place where I'm actually able to see this? And it wasn't, there wasn't slant to it. It was just video of like 15 minutes. I think the police department itself actually released the video. And I'm like, why isn't this, you know,
and I
things
think
that happen in the world, like
seeing,
the Uyghur Muslims being rounded off and shipped out in trains. And you're like, why are we talking about, you know, like when you watch US media, even people who are really like centrist and not biased, and they're totally like being like in the middle ground, they're still very much American. They're still very much in the American debate, and they can't see that these issues, like, I think the wise guy is the guy going, you know, guys, this is kind of looking like 50 years ago. Remember when this happened? But everybody's just so focused on, you know, the previous 24 hours that it's kind of hard to kind of take a bigger picture and be, I don't think this is making sense.
There's so many things I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to weigh in on that right now. You know, but I mean, like, clearly there are people who are out of hand, and clearly there are people that taunt the police and cause a reaction. But clearly there are some police that misuse their power too. So I'm like, I have a lot of distrust of people.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not 100% going to trust anyone at this point. I guess, okay, so monopolies. Would you then argue that really the government creates monopolies?
Yeah,
You don't think that capitalism itself would create a monopoly?
No, capitalism and a free market can never create a monopoly. When people talk about monopolies, they're really meaning a coercive monopoly where competition is forbidden, such as when the government encourages people to build rail lines and then says, and now nobody else can build competing rail lines. Nobody else can build new roads or anything else, right? So that's created a monopoly.
So do you think like Amazon, because I would say Amazon seems like a monopoly. Is that just a successful business that took over that? Or
it's nowhere near a monopoly. A monopoly of what?
So like, okay,
it's a
I'm just saying this because they're so successful, and I'm like, I don't really even know who their competitors are anymore. It used to be eBay or whatever, but it's like, do they even have a competitor at this point?
There's lots of people that you can go and shop online. Like if I want to buy a laptop, I don't have to go to Amazon.
No, you can. And everybody's kind of chimed. And I mean, it would seem like Netflix was, you know, kind of but I mean, now there's a ton of streaming services that are doing.
So capitalism does produce hierarchies, and it happens all the time. that people will kind of coalesce around one group. It can be one idea or one group or one company. And especially something like Amazon, where the benefit is in scale. I mean, they're able to do what they can do because of their scale.
Mm-hmm.
So a good example of like a near monopoly now would kind of be Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
Google isn't a monopoly. They just have like 90% of the marketplace. It's become synonymous. Like
As a
search
search
and
engine.
Google are
Yeah.
almost synonymous.
Mm.
But there is an example kind of going back, and this relates more to capitalism and antitrust. And it was Alcoa. They were a big aluminum manufacturer back in like the early 1920s. And they were capitalists. There was a free market. And what they did as a company was they didn't kind of lower supply to increase the prices. They just kind of maintained supply. Like if somebody wanted to buy aluminum, they said, we'll sell it to you. And they just kept the supply to match demand. And it kind of kept the prices. It's still a free market. There was some competitors, but they basically, like every time there was an anticipation of a need for more aluminum, they scaled up and they increased their capacities so that they could they really dominated. They dominated the aluminum industry. There was essentially nobody else in the aluminum industry, and
Right.
they were dismantled and torn down. And I think the president might have been put in jail because of that success, because it made it hard for people to compete against them.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. government said, yeah, this is anti-competitive. What you did is immoral. And all they did was take on every new advantage that was put forward to them, and they built their capacity so that they could meet demand. And they grew so big because they were so good at what they did, it became very hard to get into the aluminum market, right? But it wasn't a monopoly. They just gained vast market share by being really good at what they did and by being really efficient at their business processes. But
So
it
you're
was
saying that
viewed
other people
by
could
the
have gotten
government.
in,
Yeah.
like because other people could have gotten in on the same business. It's not a monopoly, even though they had basically all the market.
Yeah. Like it's not a monopoly because there is no reason anybody can compete. It's just difficult because you're so good. If you want to start a cell phone company, you can compete with Apple, not very well for a while, but there's lots of choices for like cell phones.
So it's all about innovation and innovation winning, and I really like innovation.
Yeah, but the thing with capitalism, like what if I'm gonna convince you about capitalism, what I actually need to do is convince you that altruism is bad and that selfishness is a virtue. And if you
Really?
understand that selfishness isn't a virtue and that altruism is bad, then you won't be able to see any system other than capitalism, and you'll be able to see that socialism is inherently evil because it takes away individual rights. So altruism, it's hard because we're told like it's good to sacrifice, it's good to think of others, and it's good to do that. But being charitable is quite different than actually having a group of people and actually going to one person and saying, we're going to take from you everything that's yours because we think you have more. And that's the moral thing to do, right? So in communist Russia, when millions of people died from starvation, they did so. It was a good thing because they did their role in building this great industrial nation. That was the goal of the nation, was to industrialize, to become a nuclear power, to become a world power. And so they achieved the common good. That was the common good. That was what the people wanted. And so that's the problem with
power.
And any time anyone says the common good, you should get offended at the idea of a common good. There is no common good. There's only good for individuals. And we are all better off if we all let each live as they wish, right? It's essentially the golden rule to me: do unto others as you would have them to do unto you, is capitalism. No free man is going to choose slavery. And that's why you need a revolution to impose something like communist Russia or Maoist China or Venezuela
So
or
it's a matter
Vietnam
of like,
or
so it's like I follow my self-interest, but my self-interest is ends up being the interest of others, because it's like I want them to have individual rights as well.
yeah, like we are social beings, right? Like I
Right.
mean, the idea is like a mother doesn't need to be told to care for her child.
Hmm.
But if you actually like really kind of extended this kind of state telling us what to do, the social thing, then yeah, they would need like if you don't trust that people will behave kindly to each other, um, then that's kind of your problem. I do think that people, and so right now in the US, there's a lot of strife and tension and all of this. And when Trump got elected, all of the sort of the rhetoric behind it was the system is fair, the system is rigged, and they're right. So people are upset with the system currently in place because they feel that it's rigged and unfair, and they're right. It is rigged and it is unfair. But capitalism isn't the problem. Socialism is the problem.
Hmm.
It's the fact that the government is becoming bigger and bigger, and they're taking more and more control out of your lives. They're taking money from you in form of taxation. They're making decisions that you don't agree with, and you have no say. And in the U.S., since 2010, they don't even really have democracy. They have some form of like corporatism almost, where they have unlimited anonymous political cash donations since 2010.
Hmm.
So democracy doesn't work when all of the politicians only care about like, you know, having the 1% at the top. It's fine if they have no political power. If all they
Hmm.
have is money, and they got that money by voluntary interactions with a lot of people, like Steve Jobs, he got to be rich because he improved the lives of billions of people around the world. People
Right.
who do that, people who kind of create that kind of a change, yeah, they can be the 1%. I'm okay with people having $100 billion if they got it fairly, right?
Hmm.
They didn't take anything from me to make
Right.
that money.
Right.
But the person who's arguing for a $15 minimum wage is taking from me,
Hmm.
right? They are coercively
Because products
taking
become
money
more
from me
expensive.
with a gun. Like if you use the state to get something you want, you're basically holding a gun to someone's head and saying, "Give me what's yours. It's now mine."
So small government, like, and the way that I think small government works is when it's more localized.
Yeah, I agree with you on this one.
Yeah. And I'm like, but I don't, I like a global perspective at the same time. And I think we talked about this before,
We
where
might
it's
have.
like you give the most power to like the localized government, but then you still have kind of someone overseeing how everything
Yeah.
plays out worldwide, so that we're like kind of united and we can make the world,
Yeah.
take the world in a better direction.
Like I want to kind of be like emperor of Canada. Like, and that's the other problem with democracy, like social democracy, social democrats, right? They're trying to almost it's like a Trojan horse thing where they're trying to like democracy is good and we're just going to kind of tag socialism along with it.
Hmm.
But I'm not really sure democracy is all that it's cracked up to be. Like
Hmm.
honestly, if right now we have voting age of 18, if you switched it to like landowners,
Hmm.
you actually have to own land
Hmm.
to vote in Canada. Would it change anything really? Like it changes it philosophically that everybody, you know, universal suffrage is good because everybody is equal and all of that. But do we need to change like a party system where for 4 years somebody does something and then for 4 years they undo what that person did and then for 4 years they fix what the other person did on the undoing? You know, like I want to be emperor of Canada, and I would put in like it'd be so small and I wouldn't do anything. I would just basically give everybody free rights, and then there
Hmm.
would be nothing. I wouldn't do anything. I'm not going to announce new programs or new massive spending or deficit spending. I'm just going to like, you know, here's the money. It came in, it went out. Like that's it, and
Hmm.
you can live your lives. And I mean, the people who actually interact with you are municipal government. It's people like parking meter maids and those types of people. Um,
So I
Yeah.
guess like one more thing. I guess like when we talk about government regulation, like environmental regulations, um, health regulations, like are those things that you think still need to exist, or would like an
Yeah,
actual,
yeah,
yeah,
I do, because people have rights. And I mean, if you come along and dump waste on my property, I can sue you,
mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
If you, but right now there's kind of a problem where if you dump toxic waste on my property, I can sue you. But if you dump toxic waste in a river or a public property that the state owns, what happens? Nothing.
Hmm.
If you want to know where people are doing like illegal dumps around your city, it's city property. It's
Hmm.
government owned property, because there's no person that cares about that land. And it's a
That's
weird capitalist argument, kind of on the laissez-faire, but yeah, rivers, oceans, forests, all privately owned.
so if someone actually owned the ocean, we wouldn't be
Yeah.
polluting it, is your argument.
Right. If
Interesting.
and it wouldn't be like a person, right? It would be the International Consortium of Oceanographers, or whatever. But they would own, and I mean, there's lots of different ways you can own. Like, I own the bottom, you own the top, you own,
Oh, that's
this
fascinating.
portion, I own the open. You could have different arrangements, but the fact is, yeah, like if you dumped, you would be dumping on private property, and that private entity would be able to sue you.
Crazy.
Whereas the state, it's kind of like, well, it's nobody's property, it's just kind of there. And so you get pollution in that sense.
Really interesting.
Like, you would have people owning the ocean around India suing people upstream, saying, stop dumping this plastic into my ocean from your river, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's your river. You have a responsibility to ensure that it doesn't pollute my ocean. So
Very
there's a lot of
interesting.
sort of stuff
Hmm.
too, and a lot of it is hard to wrap your head around. Like, public education is one
Hmm.
where most people would not be comfortable with saying, yeah, I would do away with public education.
Hmm.
But if you thought about it long enough and you kind of understood the history of education and how we structure it and kind of how it's progressed through, I guess, modernization and now the internet revolution, um, I would love to see lots of private schools competing and offering different programs and getting better, and actually having like reviews saying like, this school is doing really good, like all of the students coming out of this school are getting these kinds of jobs, and people are like, oh, I'm going to put my kid in this school. And the bad schools will either get better or die, whereas a public school, it just continues to exist and there's no need for it to improve.
And so with the low to no taxation, we can afford these schools as individuals.
Yes. I mean, right
Hmm.
now, I don't know how much of our taxes works, but it would be great to, if you got like a $20,000 tax rebate, if you're saying like, I'm kind of like opting out of public schools.
Hmm. Interesting.
But healthcare is one. So I'm
Hmm.
Canadian. To me, I think it's, so going back to the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I don't
Hmm.
think you can really say that you've given somebody the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if they have to worry about medical bankruptcies,
Hmm. Hmm.
or somebody can
Yep.
just say like, nope, that drug that you need to live like is no longer available to you. Like, and everybody needs health, right? So education, I might hate public schools, so why should I pay for them, right? But I still have healthcare, I still have a body, I still can break, I can still get disease. It's like the firefighters. It's kind of like the first version of socialism, but it's universal. It's like a mutual aid society where it's like,
Yep.
okay, guys, whenever somebody's house burns down, it's always this big thing. They're always destitute. How about we all just kind of band together and we get a fire department and we kind of get the
Totally.
fire insurance, and we'll all kind of take the hit on this one, right?
Hmm.
Um, but but it's not people giving up their rights, right? They're
Hmm.
participating in something that they need. Whereas, like carbon tax, the new Green Deal, funding all kinds of things. Like, what if I don't want that?
Hmm.
Like, why are you funding public transportation? Why are you giving tax breaks so parents can buy hockey equipment? Like, why is the government shouldn't be doing anything. They should be doing so little that you almost forget they're there,
Hmm.
right? Is it Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, US president said, the people should support the government, but the government shouldn't support the people. The
Hmm.
people are free. You have to go and make your own way, but we're going to stay out of your way and we're going to let you do that. And that means that, you know, if you can only make $4 an hour, that's your start. You know, like you can build skills, you can build on that. There's all kinds of like, and people help each other. It's a little known thing that as government help goes up, charitable giving goes down, because people go like, why do you need my help? You have the government. So if you took out that, then people would be more charitable and you would have better charities doing better work, I think, as well.
All right. Anything else about capitalism?
I'm going to go back to your questions. Minimum wage, capitalism, monopolies. Oh, prisons. That's kind of a tough one. And then healthcare. Yeah. If you want to touch on prisons a little bit.
So for-profit
It's not
prisons
capitalism,
seem a
right?
bit shady. But I mean, I guess that's something the government has set up, right? And so how do you fund prisons within a like purely capitalistic or this utopia you're talking
Yeah.
about where people own oceans?
Right.
You
Well,
know?
like, so right now, prisons, that's a state that is a state responsibility. Like, and I say the
Mm-hmm.
state should, the government should do very little. That is one thing the government should do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are people that the state feels they need to imprison to
Mm-hmm.
protect society, right?
Right.
Um, their incentive should be to keep them in for as little time as possible, right? To kind of,
Yes.
we
I
want to
agree
reform
completely on
them,
that.
get them
Yeah.
better, and we don't want
Absolutely.
you coming back because it costs a lot of money to keep
Mm-hmm.
people in prison.
Mm-hmm.
But in the US, you get a system where it's not like capitalism where I'm going to start a prison and anybody who's free to come to my prison and wants to stay at my prison can choose my prison. Like, no, you don't get
Right.
to choose what prison you go to, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible to have kind of capitalism or a free market. You just get corruption. And so
So
you
it's
get
like the
government paying,
government is
yeah, like for
creating
every
this
person
scenario.
you have in prison, we'll give you this much money.
Mm-hmm.
And so they overcrowd. There's no incentive to rehabilitate.
No.
And there's also a lot of times where, and time and time and time and time again, somebody goes in jail for like petty theft, and then they get an assault charge, and then
Yeah.
they punch a guard and they get 10 years, and then they kill a guy and they get 40 years. So it's like literally you go in and you had 3 months to serve, and now you're in there for your entire life. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a system inside to keep you inside as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the people making money off these prisons are lobbying governments. So governments don't really have an incentive to try and change anything.
No.
So it's just a big schmozzle. And a lot of what economists will look at will like incentives. Like, what are the incentives at play? Like, if you create a system, people will exploit it and they'll take
Totally.
advantage of it, or it'll just
Totally.
go whichever way it goes. And so with the prisons in the US, and they're not all sort of the private, there
No.
are state and municipal prisons and everything, but yeah, it's awful. And in
Mm.
Canada, I don't know if you know this, but like we should, imprisonment is supposed to be our last resort. Like a
Right.
judge at sentencing is supposed to be like, can we do this or this or this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
none of this is available. Okay, fine. We'll
Mm-hmm.
imprison this guy. But yeah, it is one spot where the state should be involved, and because the state, if their incentive should be to kind of hold you for as little time as possible and to rehabilitate you and get you back out. And
And
the
that's
other
still a
problem that happens though
small.
is like what the
Yeah.
government does with interventions is they say, okay, well, now we own housing, so public housing, so you can't get into public housing, you can't get this job, and you can't participate in this kind of government program, and we won't give you this kind of funding. And it's just a system where you just keep getting hit down and you can never actually seem to get above.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like I think that like I think our whole justice system is kind of in shambles, US and Canada.
Well, and I think when you make the small government argument, it works with prison too. because you're saying in interest to keeping costs down, we're going to keep you here as little as possible, but we don't want you coming back. And so that's really good incentive to have a good prison system, because rehabilitating is a great option.
But then
Like,
like with real capitalism, like people will call for like end the war on drugs, right? Our prisons
mhm,
are filled with,
mhm,
and it's not just possession, but it's drug related.
mhm,
And drug charges tend to kind of pile on. Like if you get a
mhm,
drug charge, then you don't have a clean record, so you're going to get other charges, and the police kind of treat you differently. And so, like in a kind of more capitalist society, a society that respected individual freedoms more, you wouldn't have the police like out to look for things. The
mhm.
state gets involved when somebody has a disagreement. So if I
Exactly.
steal from you, you call the police and then they come. They're
Right.
not out going around and checking, right? Like the
Right.
idea of being stopped on the street, like, can I see some ID? Like, no, you can't,
Hmm.
right? And the police, like, they're not our friends. They're not serving or protecting us. They're like their own little army, right? And they really do have like an us and them, and like
Hmm.
everybody out there is bad, and it's their
Hmm.
job to go out and find the bad people. I'm like, no, there's not bad people. There are individuals, and individuals will call on you when they want your involvement. If they don't call you, you shouldn't be there.
Hmm.
Like you shouldn't be, like
Interesting.
speed limits are like, why are you sitting there and just nailing me? Like I'm not doing anything wrong. This is a self-regarding action, right? If I'm driving irresponsibly or being
Right.
erratic, sure, right? That does
But
involve
there's,
others.
and that's another incentive thing, because they get quotas and it's like they have to
Yeah.
catch a certain amount of people speeding. And it's like, yeah, this is not a good system.
Yeah. Like if a cop came back at the end of the shift and was like, well, what did you do? It's like, well, I walked the beat. I talked to people in my district. I played basketball with some kids. They were like, you didn't do anything. Like, what do you mean? Like, that's what police should be. They're in the
Mm-hmm.
community and they're
Mm-hmm.
there if you need help to like settle disputes and stuff, right? Like,
Well,
it's the whole kind of the mindset
mm-hmm.
with police. And it also factors in with unions too, because a lot of the problems are unions fighting to keep people in jobs, and they shouldn't have those jobs. It's
Hmm.
very hard to get rid of bad police officers, because when you try to fire somebody for being incompetent or just a bad person, you can't, because unions get in the way, right?
You've
So it's
given
all
me,
state intervention.
yes, you've given me a lot to think about, Brad. Thank you
Yeah,
very much. I guess we said last time, connect with you on Facebook,
sure, sure.
LinkedIn.
No, do
No,
Facebook.
just Facebook. Okay, we'll go with that.
I
But
might see that.
but thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a wonderful thing, capitalism.
Always a joy, Brad. We'll
Thank
do
you,
this
John.
again.
Air Smudge.